The cleaner's mop clattered to the floor as laughter echoed down the aisle. "Careful," one attendant sneered. "You'll never belong up here." Passengers smirked, some shaking their heads, others pretending not to notice. But the woman's eyes didn't flinch, calm, steady, as if she knew a secret. Moments later, she walked past them straight toward the cockpit door. And when it opened, the crew's laughter died in their throats. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The airport pulsed with its usual rhythm. Suitcases rattling across the polished floor, voices echoing through the wide glass halls, and the constant hum of announcements calling passengers to their gates. In the middle of all that movement, a woman in a plain navy blue cleaning uniform pushed her cart quietly along the terminal. Her name was Amara Johnson. To most, she was invisible, just another worker blending into the background. But there was something in the way she carried herself, her back straight, her eyes sharp, that hinted at a story no one around her could see. Near the gate for Skylux Airlines Flight 709, the flight crew stood in a small circle, laughing among themselves. Their uniforms were crisp, their badges gleaming, their voices loud enough to draw attention. They were young, confident, and full of the kind of arrogance that comes from believing the world belongs to you. One of the attendants, tall, with slicked back hair, tilted his chin toward Amara. "Look at her," he muttered, not quietly enough. "Scrubbing floors while we're flying the skies. Some people just don't aim high enough." The others chuckled. A woman with a sharp laugh added, "She probably dreams of sitting in first class, but this is as close as she'll ever get." Amara heard every word. She didn't flinch, didn't look their way. She bent down, picked up a discarded coffee cup, dropped it into her trash bag, and kept moving. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. The crew's laughter grew bolder, their arrogance filling the space like stale air. Passengers nearby glanced at them, some frowning, but no one spoke up. After all, it wasn't their fight. Amara paused for a moment, her hand resting on the handle of her cart. She looked up at the massive windows where planes rolled across the runway, engines roaring like beasts ready to leap into the sky. Her reflection stared back at her, not just a cleaner, but a woman with a secret. She whispered under her breath, so softly only she could hear, "Let them laugh. They'll cease soon enough." Her shift was nearly over, but she didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, wiping down a row of seats, straightening a stack of magazines, collecting crumbs left behind by hurried travelers. She worked with the precision of someone who respected every detail, no matter how small. The crew, meanwhile, strutted toward the boarding gate, their earlier mockery tucked behind professional smiles as passengers began lining up. Amara pushed her cart aside, removed her gloves, folded them neatly, and placed them on top. Then, with a quiet inhale, she walked toward the jet bridge. The crew noticed her approaching and exchanged puzzled glances. Ma'am," one of them said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Cleaning's done. You can't go in there now." Amara didn't respond. She kept walking, her steps steady, her gaze fixed ahead. The tall attendant stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Excuse me. This area is for staff and passengers only. You can't just—" He stopped when Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. She held it up, and his words died in his throat. The card bore the Skylux Airlines insignia, not a staff badge, not a boarding pass, but something far rarer. His eyes widened. "Wait, is that—" Amara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Step aside." Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the laughter instantly. The crew hesitated, but something in her tone made them obey. Passengers continued boarding, but their eyes followed her now. The same woman mocked for scrubbing floors was striding with authority, her presence commanding the space. She placed her hand on the cockpit door. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crew exchanged nervous whispers, their earlier arrogance crumbling into confusion. Amara glanced back at them, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she opened the door and stepped inside. The laughter was gone. In its place was silence, heavy, awkward, and filled with questions no one dared to ask. And somewhere in that silence, a truth was beginning to take shape, one that would leave them all speechless. Have you ever been underestimated, only to know that the truth would one day shock everyone around you? The silence that followed Amara's entrance into the cockpit clung to the air like a heavy fog. The crew, who only minutes ago had been laughing so freely, now stood frozen, their polished smiles slipping into uneasy frowns. They exchanged quick glances, each one silently asking the other if they had just witnessed what they thought they had. The cleaner, no, the woman they had mocked, had walked into the cockpit as if she belonged there. One of the younger attendants, his confidence shaken, tried to laugh it off. "Maybe she's delivering something," he muttered, though his voice cracked halfway through. No one responded. The tall attendant who had blocked her path earlier shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as though the uniform that once gave him authority now felt like a costume. Passengers continued boarding, oblivious to the tension simmering among the crew. A businessman in a gray suit brushed past, nodding politely at the attendants, who were too distracted to return the gesture. A mother guided her child down the aisle, the little boy pointing excitedly at the cockpit door that had just closed behind Amara. "Mom, is she the pilot?" he asked innocently. The mother smiled, shushing him, but the question lingered in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. Inside their circle, the crew whispered in hurried tones. "Who is she?" one asked. "She can't just walk in there." Another shook her head. "Did you see that card she showed? That wasn't a staff badge. It looked official." The arrogance that had fueled their laughter earlier was unraveling thread by thread. They had built their pride on uniforms, titles, and the illusion of superiority. But in a single moment, Amara had shattered that foundation. The memory of their mocking words now echoed back at them, sharper and more humiliating than before. The tall attendant clenched his jaw, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, maybe she's some kind of inspector. Or a VIP guest. That doesn't mean anything." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he knew there was more to her presence than that. The boarding process slowed, and the crew forced themselves to resume their duties, greeting passengers with strained smiles. Yet their eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door, as though expecting it to open again and reveal the truth they were too afraid to face. Every second of waiting stretched longer, the silence between them filled with unspoken guilt. Amara's absence from the cabin only deepened the mystery. The woman they had dismissed as a cleaner was now behind the very door that symbolized authority and control. The irony was suffocating. They had laughed at her for being beneath them, yet she now stood above them in a way they couldn't comprehend. The sharp-laughed attendant finally broke the silence, her voice low and uneasy. "Do you think she owns this plane?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, and the others stared at her, wide-eyed. The thought was absurd, impossible even. And yet, the image of Amara's calm smile as she held up the black card made the idea feel terrifyingly real. Passengers settled into their seats, unaware of the storm brewing among the crew. The attendants moved through the motions, stowing bags, offering assistance, but their minds were elsewhere. Every laugh they had shared earlier now felt like a weight pressing down on their chests. The tall attendant, desperate to shake off the unease, muttered under his breath, "She's just a cleaner. That's all she'll ever be." But even he didn't believe his own words anymore. And then, as if to mock their denial, the cockpit door opened just a crack. A sliver of light spilled into the cabin, and for a heartbeat, the crew held their breath. They couldn't see her face, but they could hear her voice, calm, steady, and commanding. as she spoke to the pilots inside. The attendants froze. That voice didn't belong to a cleaner. It belonged to someone who carried authority, someone who was used to being obeyed. The door closed again, leaving them in silence once more. But the damage was done. The seed of truth had been planted, and it was growing fast, breaking apart the arrogance they had worn like armor. They had laughed at her. Now, they were afraid of her. If you were in their place, would you swallow your pride and apologize? Or would you cling to denial even as the truth stared you in the face? The hum of the engines outside grew louder as the final passengers settled into their seats. But inside the cabin, the crew's nerves were unraveling. Every glance toward the cockpit door carried the same unspoken question. Who was she? The woman they had mocked only minutes ago had vanished behind that door with the kind of authority none of them could fake. The tall attendant, still trying to salvage his pride, leaned against the galley counter and whispered, "She can't really belong in there. Maybe she's just delivering something to the pilots." His words sounded hollow even to him. The others didn't reply. They had all heard her voice, calm, commanding, the kind of voice that didn't ask for permission but expected obedience. Passengers were buckling seatbelts, adjusting bags, and flipping through magazines, unaware of the storm brewing among the crew. A businessman in first class asked for water, and the sharp-laughed attendant nearly dropped the glass as she poured it, her hands trembling. She forced a smile, but her mind was still on the woman in the cockpit. The door opened again, just slightly, and the crew stiffened. A sliver of light spilled into the cabin, and Amara's silhouette appeared for a moment. She was speaking to the captain, her tone measured, her words too low to catch. But the way the captain nodded, the way the co-pilot leaned inattentively, told the crew everything they needed to know. This wasn't a cleaner asking for a favor. This was someone giving instructions. The door closed once more, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The tall attendant muttered, "No way. No way she can't be." But his voice cracked, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. The sharp-laughed attendant finally whispered what they were all thinking. "What if she owns this plane?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. It sounded absurd, but the memory of that sleek black card, the way she carried herself, the authority in her voice, it all fit together too perfectly. The crew's arrogance began to crumble into panic. They replayed every cruel word they had said, every laugh, every sneer. The shame pressed down on them heavier than the luggage in the overhead bins. They had mocked her for being beneath them, and now the possibility that she was far above them was unbearable. One of the younger attendants whispered, "If she really is the owner, we're finished." His face had gone pale, his hands twisting nervously at the hem of his uniform. The tall attendant tried to steady himself, but his voice betrayed him. "She's not. She can't be. Owners don't clean the floors." Yet even as he said it, he remembered the way she had looked at him, calm, patient, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. The engines roared louder, the plane preparing for departure. But inside the cabin the crew could barely breathe. Every second stretched longer, every sound sharper. They were trapped in their own guilt, waiting for the truth to crash down on them. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife, the intercom crackled to life. A familiar voice filled the cabin, steady, confident, unmistakable. It was Amara. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone carrying the weight of authority. "Welcome aboard Skylux Airlines Flight 709. I'm Amara Johnson, and I want to personally thank you for choosing to fly with us today." The crew froze. Their hearts pounded in their chests. Passengers smiled, some clapping politely, unaware of the drama unfolding just a few feet away. But for the crew, every word was a revelation. The woman they had mocked wasn't just in the cockpit. She was addressing the passengers as if she owned the skies themselves. The tall attendant's face was drained of color. The sharp-laughed attendant covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The younger crew members exchanged wide-eyed stares, their arrogance shattered beyond repair. The truth was no longer a possibility. It was undeniable. The woman they had laughed at was the one in charge. If you had mocked someone only to discover they held your future in their hands, what would you do? Apologize? Or hope they never remembered your cruelty? The cabin was alive with the usual shuffle of passengers settling in, but for the crew, every sound felt distant, muffled by the pounding of their own hearts. The intercom had just carried Amara's voice across the aircraft, calm and commanding, and it had shattered the illusion they had built around themselves. The woman they had mocked was not only in the cockpit. She was speaking as though she belonged there, as though the entire plane was hers to command. The tall attendant's hands trembled as he adjusted a passenger's bag in the overhead bin. His polished smile was gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that betrayed his unease. The sharp-laughed attendant avoided eye contact with everyone. Her earlier confidence drained away. The younger crew members moved stiffly, their rehearsed greetings faltering as they tried to mask the storm raging inside them. Passengers, oblivious to the tension, clapped politely at Amara's announcement. A child in the second row whispered to his father, "She sounds important," and the father nodded, smiling. "She must be the boss." The words cut through the crew like a blade. The cockpit door opened again, and this time Amara stepped out. She no longer wore the quiet invisibility of a cleaner. Her presence filled the cabin with an authority that silenced every whisper. She walked with measured steps, her gaze steady, her posture unshakable. The crew froze where they stood, their eyes wide, their throats dry. Amara stopped in front of them. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence was heavier than any reprimand. The tall attendant shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance now a memory he wished he could erase. The sharp-laughed attendant lowered her eyes, unable to meet Amara's gaze. Finally, Amara spoke, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I heard your laughter." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. The crew flinched as though struck. She let the silence stretch again, forcing them to sit with their shame. Then she continued, "You saw a uniform and decided it told you everything you needed to know about me. You judged, you mocked, and you believed yourself above me." The tall attendant opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Amara's eyes locked on his, and he looked away, his face burning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the sleek black card once more. Holding it up for them to see, she said, "This is not a staff badge. It is not a boarding pass. It is proof of ownership. Skylux Airlines is mine. Every plane, every route, every uniform you wear, it all answers to me." The words hit like thunder. The crew's faces were drained of color. Their arrogance, their laughter, their superiority, all of it crumbled in an instant. They had mocked the very woman who signed their paychecks, who held their futures in her hands. Passengers nearby gasped, some whispering in surprise. A businessman in first class leaned forward, eyes wide, as though witnessing a scene from a film. The child who had spoken earlier clapped his hands together, grinning. "I knew it. She's the boss." Amara lowered the card and slipped it back into her pocket. Her gaze swept over the crew, not with anger, but with a calm disappointment that cut deeper than rage ever could. "Respect," she said softly, "is not about uniforms or titles. It is about humanity. Remember that." She turned and walked back toward the cockpit, her steps steady, her presence undeniable. The crew stood frozen, their shame heavy, their laughter now a memory that would haunt them. The cockpit door closed behind her, and the silence that followed was absolute. If you were in their place, would you find the courage to apologize, or would you let your pride keep you silent? The engines roared as the plane began taxiing down the runway, but inside the cabin the crew's thoughts were far from the safety demonstration they were supposed to be preparing for. Their minds were trapped in the echo of Amara's words, "Skylux Airlines is mine." The revelation had shaken them to their core. The woman they had mocked for scrubbing floors was not only their superior, she was the owner of everything around them. Amara had returned to the cockpit, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the crew. Every passenger they greeted, every instruction they gave, fell hollow now. Their polished smiles had cracked, and behind them was only fear and shame. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Amara sat in the cockpit, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The city lights below blurred into streaks of gold, and for a moment she allowed herself to drift back into memory. She remembered the first time she had walked into an airport, not as an owner, not even as an employee, but as a child. Her mother had been a cleaner too, working long hours to keep the terminal spotless. Amara had followed her through the vast halls, clutching her hand, watching the planes take off with wide-eyed wonder. She had dreamed of flying, of belonging to that world of power and possibility. But the world had not been kind. As she grew older, she had taken the same cleaning jobs her mother once held. She scrubbed floors, emptied trash bins, and endured the same dismissive glances, the same cruel laughter. People saw the uniform and assumed they knew her story. They never asked about her dreams, her ambitions, or the fire that burned quietly inside her. But Amara had been patient. Every paycheck she earned, she saved. Every insult she endured, she turned into fuel. She studied at night, took courses in business and aviation, and built connections with people who believed in her vision. Slowly, piece by piece, she climbed. She invested in small ventures, then larger ones, until the day came when she had enough to buy her first stake in Skylux Airlines. From there, she rose higher, until the company itself was hers. The memory of those years washed over her now, and she smiled faintly. The irony was not lost on her, that the very uniform people mocked had been her disguise, her shield. She had walked among them unseen, learning, observing, waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. Back in the cabin, the crew whispered nervously among themselves. "Did you hear her?" one asked. "She said she owns the airline." The tall attendant shook his head, his pride still clinging to denial. Maybe she was bluffing. Maybe she just wanted to scare us. But his voice lacked conviction, and the others knew it. The sharp-laughed attendant, who had once mocked Amara the loudest, now sat in silence, her hands trembling as she folded napkins for the drink service. She replayed every cruel word she had spoken, each one now a dagger twisting in her chest. Passengers, unaware of the storm beneath the crew's polished surface, relaxed into their seats. Some watched movies, others dozed off, while a few chatted about the mysterious woman who had spoken over the intercom. "She sounded powerful," one passenger said, "like she wasn't just a pilot, but someone bigger." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the truth. In the cockpit, Amara leaned back in her seat, her eyes still on the horizon. She thought of her mother, of the laughter she had endured, of the countless nights she had spent dreaming of this very moment. And now here she was, flying not just as a passenger, not just as a pilot, but as the owner of the skies. Her voice echoed in her mind, the words she had spoken to the crew. Respect is not about uniforms or titles. It is about humanity. She knew they would never forget it. And yet, she also knew this was only the beginning. Have you ever carried the weight of being underestimated for years, only to finally stand in the place you once dreamed of? The plane had leveled off above the clouds, the city lights far below, now nothing more than a faint glow against the darkness. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was strangely heavy. Passengers chatted softly, some already drifting into sleep, but the crew moved like shadows, their usual confidence stripped away. Every smile they forced felt brittle, every word rehearsed. They could not shake the image of Amara standing before them, declaring her ownership of the airline with calm authority. The tall attendant, who had once led the laughter, now avoided the eyes of his colleagues. He busied himself with trivial tasks, straightening a stack of magazines, adjusting a seatbelt that didn't need adjusting, anything to keep from facing the shame that burned inside him. The sharp-laughed attendant, usually the loudest voice in the group, was silent now, her hands trembling as she poured drinks for passengers. The younger crew members whispered nervously to one another, their voices low, their faces pale. Passengers began to notice the tension. A woman in row 7 leaned toward her husband and murmured, "The crew seems off tonight." He nodded, frowning. "Something's not right." A businessman in first class glanced at the attendants, his sharp eyes catching the stiffness in their movements. He had flown often enough to know when something unusual was happening. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Amara sat with quiet composure. The captain and co-pilot treated her with the respect she commanded, listening carefully as she spoke. She wasn't there to micromanage their flight, but her presence reminded them that this was more than just another journey. It was a statement. Back in the cabin, the tall attendant finally broke the silence among the crew. "We need to do something," he whispered, his voice tight. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen." The sharp-laughed attendant shook her head quickly. "What do you suggest? Apologize? She owns the airline. She could fire us on the spot." The younger attendant, his voice trembling, said, "Maybe she won't. Maybe if we show respect now, she'll forgive us." His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. The tall attendant clenched his fists. Pride still clung to them, but it was slipping fast. He remembered the way Amara had looked at him, calm, steady, as though she had seen through every layer of arrogance he had built. He knew she hadn't forgotten his words. As the crew debated in hushed tones, Amara's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cruising at 35,000 feet. Please relax and enjoy your flight." Her tone was warm, professional, but beneath it was a quiet strength that made the crew flinch. Every word reminded them of who she was, and who they had been to her only hours ago. The passengers clapped politely again, some smiling, some nodding in approval. To them, it was just another announcement. But to the crew, it was a reminder of their mistake, a reminder that the woman they had mocked now held their futures in her hands. The sharp-laughed attendant whispered, almost to herself, "She's not just the owner. She's bigger than that. Did you see the way the pilots listened to her? Like she was the one in command." The younger attendant nodded slowly. "She is in command of all of this." The tall attendant swallowed hard, his pride finally cracking. "We have to face her," he said quietly. "We can't hide behind fake smiles. Not anymore." The others looked at him, fear in their eyes. Facing her meant confronting their own cruelty, their own arrogance. It meant admitting they had been wrong. And yet, deep down, they knew he was right. If you had mocked someone only to discover they held your destiny in their hands, would you have the courage to face them, or would you hope to disappear into silence? The cabin lights dimmed as the plane settled into its long stretch of flight. Passengers reclined into their seats, some already drifting into sleep, others absorbed in movies or books. But for the crew, there was no rest. Every movement felt heavy. Every glance toward the cockpit door a reminder of the truth they could no longer deny. The tall attendant stood near the galley, his jaw tight, his hands restless. He had been the loudest in mocking Amara, and now the weight of his words pressed down on him like lead. He replayed them in his mind, every cruel laugh, every dismissive comment, and each memory stung sharper than the last. The sharp-laughed attendant sat quietly at the jump seat, her usual chatter gone. She stared at her hands, twisting them nervously, her face pale. The younger crew members whispered in hushed tones, their voices trembling with uncertainty. Finally, the tall attendant broke the silence. "We can't keep pretending," he said, his voice low but firm. "She knows what we said. She heard us. If we don't face her now, it'll be worse later." The sharp-laughed attendant shook her head quickly. "Face her? And say what? That we're sorry? Sorry for laughing at the woman who owns the airline? She'll never forgive us." The younger attendant, his voice soft but steady, spoke up. "Maybe she will. Maybe that's the point. She didn't humiliate us in front of the passengers. She could have, but she didn't. She gave us a chance. The words hung in the air, fragile but true. Amara had every opportunity to expose them, to strip away their pride in front of everyone, but she hadn't. Instead, she had spoken calmly, reminding them of respect, of humanity. It was as though she had left the door open for them to choose what kind of people they wanted to be. The tall attendant exhaled slowly, his pride cracking further. We have to go to her. Together. If we wait until the flight is over, it'll be too late. The others hesitated. Fear etched into their faces. But deep down, they knew he was right. The shame they carried would not fade on its own. They had to confront it, to face the woman they had mocked and admit their mistake. As they debated, a passenger in first class leaned toward them, curiosity in his eyes. "Is everything all right?" he asked. The sharp-laughed attendant forced a smile, nodding quickly. "Of course, sir. Everything is fine." But her voice wavered, betraying the truth. When the passenger turned away, the tall attendant straightened his shoulders. "Enough," he said quietly. "We're going to her. Now." The crew exchanged nervous glances, their fear battling with the weight of their guilt. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded. Together, they began to move toward the cockpit, their steps hesitant, their hearts pounding. The passengers barely noticed as the crew gathered near the door, but for the attendants, every step felt like walking into judgment. The tall attendant raised his hand, hesitated, then knocked softly on the cockpit door. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened, and Amara stood there, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. She looked at them, and in that gaze was everything they feared and everything they hoped for. The tall attendant swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he spoke. We need to talk. If you were in their place, would you have the courage to admit your mistake, or would you let fear keep you silent forever?" The knock on the cockpit door had been soft, almost hesitant, but when it opened and Amara stepped out, the crew felt as though the entire weight of the sky had descended upon them. She stood in the narrow space just beyond the door, her presence commanding, without a word. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but inside the cabin, it was her gaze that held everything still. The tall attendant, who had once laughed the loudest, found his throat dry. He had rehearsed a dozen excuses in his mind, but now, standing before her, every word dissolved. The sharp-laughed attendant lowered her eyes, unable to meet Amara's steady stare. The younger crew members shifted nervously, their hands fidgeting, their breaths shallow. Amara said nothing at first. She let the silence stretch, her calm eyes moving from one face to the next. It was not anger that they saw in her expression, but something far more unsettling, disappointment. That quiet, unshakable disappointment that made their shame burn hotter than any outburst could have. Finally, the tall attendant spoke, his voice breaking. We owe you an apology." The words were clumsy, but they were the truth. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "We judged you. We mocked you. And we were wrong." The sharp-laughed attendant's voice trembled as she added, "We thought we knew who you were, just by looking at you. We didn't see, we didn't respect you." Her eyes glistened, her earlier arrogance shattered. The younger attendant, his voice barely above a whisper, said, "We're sorry." Truly. Amara listened, her face unreadable. When they finished, she let the silence linger once more, as though weighing their words. Then she spoke, her tone calm but firm. "Do you think your apology erases the way you treated me? Do you think words alone can undo the harm of judgment?" The crew flinched, their shame deepening. None of them dared to answer. Amara's voice softened, but her words carried weight. Respect is not something you give only when you believe someone has power. True respect is given because every human being deserves it. You laughed because you thought I was beneath you. But tell me, if I were still pushing that cart, if I were still wearing this uniform every day, would you treat me differently now? The question struck them harder than any reprimand. They shifted uncomfortably, unable to respond. The truth was written on their faces, and Amara saw it clearly. She stepped closer, her presence filling the narrow aisle. I don't need your apology for myself. I've endured worse than your laughter. But you need to understand this, for your own sake. The way you treat those you believe are powerless reveals who you truly are. And one day, when you least expect it, the world will show you the cost of that arrogance. The tall attendant lowered his head, his pride finally broken. The sharp-laughed attendant wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. We'll do better. We have to. Amara studied them for a long moment, then gave a single nod. Then prove it. Not to me, but to every person you meet from this day forward. Because you never know who is watching. You never know who carries the power to change your life. With that, she turned and stepped back into the cockpit, the door closing softly behind her. The crew stood frozen, their hearts pounding, their shame heavy. They had faced her, confessed their guilt, and been given not forgiveness, but something far more valuable, a lesson they would never forget. If you were given a second chance after mocking someone, would you truly change? Or would you slip back into old habits once the moment passed? The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Most passengers were lost in their own worlds, some watching movies, others drifting into sleep, a few whispering softly to their companions. But beneath that calm surface, the tension among the crew was unmistakable. Their movements were stiff, their smiles strained, their eyes flicking nervously toward the cockpit door as though it held the weight of their fate. The tall attendant leaned against the galley counter, his mind replaying the confrontation with Amara over and over. He had apologized, yes, but the memory of his laughter still echoed in his ears, louder than the roar of the engines. He wondered if she would ever truly forgive them, or if forgiveness was even what she intended. The sharp-laughed attendant sat quietly, her usual chatter gone. She had been the one who mocked Amara the most, and now the shame gnawed at her like a relentless tide. Every time she looked at a passenger, she imagined what they would think if they knew the truth, that the crew they trusted had ridiculed the very woman who owned the airline. The younger attendants whispered in hushed tones, their voices trembling. She gave us a chance, one said. She didn't humiliate us in front of everyone. That means something. But even as they spoke, their eyes betrayed their fear. Passengers, though unaware of the full story, began to sense that something unusual was happening. A businessman in first class leaned toward his neighbor. The crew seems unsettled tonight, he murmured. His neighbor nodded, frowning. It's like they're walking on eggshells. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Amara sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of night sky ahead. The captain and co-pilot respected her presence, speaking only when necessary, their tones deferential. Amara's mind, however, was not on the flight path. It was on the lesson she had just delivered. She had seen the shame in their eyes, the cracks in their arrogance. But she also knew that shame alone was not enough. Change required more than guilt, it required action. Back in the cabin, the tall attendant finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. We've apologized. But is that enough? What if she doesn't believe us? What if she thinks we're only sorry because we got caught? The sharp-laughed attendant's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. She's right, she whispered. Respect isn't about power. It's about humanity. And we failed that test. The younger attendant nodded slowly. Then maybe the only way to prove we've changed is to start now. With every passenger. With every person we meet. Not because she owns the airline, but because it's the right thing to do. The words struck them all. Simple yet undeniable. They couldn't undo what they had done, but they could choose who they would be from this moment forward. As the plane soared through the night, the crew moved through the cabin with a new kind of humility. Their smiles were no longer polished masks, but tentative gestures of sincerity. They listened more closely to passengers, offered help with genuine care, and carried themselves with a quiet awareness of the lesson they had been given. And though Amara remained in the cockpit, her presence was everywhere, in the way the crew spoke, in the way they carried themselves, in the way they began to understand that respect was not a performance, but a choice. Have you ever realized too late that your actions revealed more about you than your words ever could? The night sky stretched endlessly outside the windows, stars scattered like diamonds across velvet. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engines was steady, but the atmosphere among the crew was anything but calm. They moved through the aisles with forced smiles, their bodies tense, their thoughts consumed by the woman in the cockpit. Passengers began to notice. A mother in row 12 leaned toward her teenage daughter and whispered, "The crew seems nervous tonight." The daughter shrugged, but her eyes lingered on the attendants, sensing the same unease. In first class, a businessman adjusted his tie and frowned. He had flown often enough to recognize when something was off. The tall attendant carried a tray of drinks, his hands trembling slightly. He tried to steady himself, but the memory of Amara's words echoed in his mind. Respect is not about uniforms or titles. It is about humanity. He had mocked her, dismissed her, and now every passenger he served felt like a reminder of his failure. The sharp-laughed attendant, usually so quick with jokes, was silent. She moved carefully, her eyes lowered, her voice soft. When a passenger thanked her, she flinched, as though unworthy of the kindness. The younger attendants, though less guilty, carried the same weight. They had laughed too, even if only to fit in, and now the shame clung to them like a shadow. Passengers began whispering among themselves. "Did you hear the announcement earlier?" one asked. "That woman, Amara Johnson. She sounded important." Another nodded. "I think she's more than important. The crew looks terrified of her." The murmur spread, curiosity growing. Some passengers leaned into the aisle, trying to catch a glimpse of the cockpit door. Others speculated quietly, their imaginations filling in the blanks. The story was beginning to ripple outward, even without the full truth. In the galley, the crew huddled together briefly. The tall attendant's voice was low, urgent. "They're starting to notice. The passengers can see something's wrong." The sharp-laughed attendant shook her head. "What do? We can't tell them the truth." The younger attendant spoke softly. "Maybe we don't have to. Maybe the way we act will tell them everything they need to know." The words struck them. They couldn't erase what they had done, but they could choose how to carry themselves now. They could choose humility, sincerity, respect. Not just for Amara, but for everyone. And so they tried. The tall attendant knelt to help an elderly passenger stow her bag, his voice gentle. The sharp-laughed attendant offered a blanket to a child, her smile small but genuine. The younger attendants moved through the cabin with care, listening, assisting, treating each passenger as though they mattered. The passengers noticed the change. Whispers shifted from suspicion to surprise. "They're being unusually attentive tonight," one man said. A woman nodded. "It feels different, like they actually care." In the cockpit, Amara listened to the faint sounds of the cabin behind her. She knew the crew was struggling, knew they were trying to find their footing after the lesson she had given them. She didn't need to watch them to know the truth. Change was never easy, but it always began in small steps. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering her own journey. She had once been invisible too, dismissed, mocked, underestimated. And yet, she had risen. Now perhaps these attendants would rise as well, not in rank or title, but in character. The plane soared higher into the night, carrying with it not just passengers, but a story unfolding quietly in the spaces between shame and redemption. Have you ever witnessed someone change right before your eyes and wondered if it was real or just for show? The hours of the flight stretched on, but for the crew, time felt heavier than the altitude pressing against the cabin walls. They moved through their duties with a strange quietness, their earlier arrogance replaced by a humility that passengers could sense but not fully understand. Every smile was softer now, every gesture more careful, as though they were trying to rewrite the story of who they had been only a few hours earlier. Passengers whispered among themselves, curiosity growing. A woman in business class leaned toward her seatmate. That announcement earlier. Amara Johnson. Do you think she's more than just a pilot? Her seatmate nodded thoughtfully. The way the crew looks at her, she's not just a pilot. She's someone important. Maybe even the owner. The words rippled through the rows, speculation spreading like wildfire. The tall attendant overheard the whispers and felt his stomach twist. The truth was beginning to leak into the cabin, not through official words, but through the weight of Amara's presence. He glanced toward the cockpit door, his chest tightening. He had mocked her, dismissed her, and now passengers were piecing together the truth he wished he could hide. The sharp-laughed attendant, her earlier bravado long gone, found herself lingering at row 12, where a young girl tugged at her sleeve. "Miss," the girl whispered, "is that lady in the cockpit really the boss?" The attendant froze, her throat tightening. She forced a smile, kneeling down to the child's level. "She's someone very special," she said softly. The girl grinned, satisfied with the answer, but the attendant's heart pounded. She knew the truth was too big to stay hidden much longer. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Amara sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The captain and co-pilot worked quietly, their respect for her evident in every glance, every deferential nod. Amara's thoughts, however, drifted backward once more, to the years of struggle, the countless nights she had spent studying, saving, building. She remembered the faces of those who had doubted her, the laughter she had endured, the doors that had been slammed in her face. And she remembered the promise she had made to herself, that one day she would not only rise above it, but she would own the very skies that others had told her she would never touch. Her journey was not just about success. It was about proving that dignity could not be stripped away by a uniform, that worth was not defined by the job others saw. She had carried that truth with her through every hardship, and now, sitting in the cockpit of her own airline, she carried it still. Back in the cabin, the crew gathered briefly in the galley, their voices hushed. "The passengers are starting to figure it out," the younger attendant whispered. "They're asking questions." The tall attendant rubbed his forehead, his pride long gone. "We can't stop them. She's not hiding who she is. Maybe she wants them to know." The sharp-laughed attendant's voice cracked as she spoke. "Then what happens to us? When will they all know what we did?" The younger attendant looked at her, his expression steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Then we live with it, and we prove we've changed. That's all we can do." The words settled over them like a quiet truth. They couldn't erase the past, but they could choose the future. And perhaps, in some way, that was the lesson Amara had intended all along. As the plane soared through the night, passengers leaned into the aisles, whispering, speculating, piecing together the story unfolding around them. The crew moved with humility, their every action now a silent apology. And in the cockpit, Amara remained calm, her presence shaping the flight in ways no announcement ever could. The cabin had grown quieter as the hours passed, but beneath the calm hum of the engines, a current of tension still lingered. Passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering, others stealing curious glances toward the cockpit door. The whispers had spread like wildfire, about the mysterious woman who had spoken over the intercom, about the way the crew seemed shaken, about the possibility that she was more than just a pilot. The tall attendant moved down the aisle with a tray, his posture stiff, his smile thin. He could feel the passengers' eyes on him, their curiosity pressing against his skin. Every polite "thank you" felt like a reminder of the arrogance he had once carried, and every glance toward the cockpit reminded him of the truth he could no longer escape. The sharp-laughed attendant, who had once mocked Amara the loudest, now found herself shrinking under the weight of her own guilt. She offered drinks and blankets with a quiet humility, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. A passenger in row 8 smiled at her and said, "You're being very kind tonight." The words, meant as a compliment, struck her like a confession. She forced a smile, but her eyes burned with shame. The younger attendants, though less guilty, carried the same burden. They moved carefully, their gestures deliberate, their voices steady but subdued. They had learned the lesson too. Respect was not optional, and arrogance could crumble in an instant. In first class, the murmurs grew louder. A businessman leaned toward his neighbor. "I've flown Skylux for years. I've never seen a crew behave like this. Something's different." His neighbor nodded. "It's her. The woman who spoke earlier. You can feel it. She's not just a pilot. She's in charge." The speculation spread, passengers piecing together fragments of truth. Some believed she was an executive. Others whispered she was the owner. The story was unfolding in real time, and the cabin had become its stage. Then, as if to answer their questions, the cockpit door opened. Amara stepped out, her presence commanding the space instantly. She no longer wore the invisibility of a cleaner. She walked with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to teach. The passengers fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. The crew froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Amara stood in the aisle, her gaze sweeping over them all. "I know there are questions," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily through the cabin. "You've heard my name. You've seen the way the crew looks at me. So let me tell you the truth." The silence deepened, every ear straining to hear. "My name is Amara Johnson. I am not a cleaner. I am not just a pilot. I am the owner of Skylux Airlines." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, their whispers rising into a wave of astonishment. The businessman in first class leaned back in his seat, stunned. The young girl in row 12 clapped her hands together, grinning. "I knew it," she whispered to her mother. Amara's gaze shifted to the crew, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. "Earlier tonight, some of your attendants forgot what respect means. They judged me by a uniform, by what they thought they saw. They laughed. But respect is not about titles or appearances. It is about humanity. And that is a lesson I intend for all of us to remember." The crew lowered their heads, shame burning in their faces. The passengers watched in silence, some frowning, others nodding in agreement. Amara let the moment linger, then softened her tone. This airline was built on a promise that every person who steps aboard will be treated with dignity. That promise applies to passengers, to crew, to everyone. Tonight, you've seen what happens when that promise is broken. But you've also seen what it means to learn, to change, to grow. Her words hung in the air, heavy yet hopeful. The passengers sat in silence, moved by the revelation. The crew stood frozen, their shame now tempered by the faintest spark of redemption. Amara gave a small nod, then turned and walked back toward the cockpit. The door closed softly behind her, but the echo of her words remained, filling the cabin with a weight no one would forget. If you had been in that cabin, watching the truth unfold before your eyes, would you have judged her too? Or would you have seen the strength behind the uniform? The cabin was still buzzing from Amara's revelation. Passengers whispered in awe, some leaning into the aisles to catch another glimpse of her, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The idea that the woman they had seen in a cleaner's uniform was, in fact, the owner of the airline felt like something out of a film. Yet, here they were, living it. The crew, however, felt none of the wonder. For them, the moment was suffocating. Every passenger's curious glance felt like a spotlight exposing their shame. They had mocked her, dismissed her, and now the entire cabin knew who she truly was. The tall attendant stood rigid near the galley, his face pale, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away. The sharp-laughed attendant avoided eye contact with everyone, her hands trembling as she poured coffee for a passenger who thanked her warmly, unaware of the storm inside her. Passengers began to talk more openly now. A man in business class leaned toward his neighbor. "Can you believe it? The owner of the airline walking among us like that." His neighbor nodded. eyes wide. And the crew, did you see their faces? They looked like children caught in a lie. The whispers spread, and the crew could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on them. They had been exposed not by Amara's anger, but by her truth. And that truth was louder than any reprimand could have been. In the cockpit, Amara sat quietly, her gaze steady on the horizon. She had not revealed their cruelty to the passengers. She had not humiliated them. Instead, she had spoken of respect, of humanity, of dignity. She had given them the chance to decide who they would become after this night. But she knew the choice would not be easy. Change never was. Back in cabin, the tall attendant finally broke the silence among the crew. His voice was low, almost a whisper. They all know now. Every passenger. They're looking at us differently. The sharp-laughed attendant's eyes filled with tears. And they should. We deserve it. The younger attendant, though shaken, spoke with quiet conviction. Then let's prove we're not the people we were a few hours ago. Let's show them we've learned. The words struck them all. They couldn't erase what they had done, but they could choose what they would do now. Slowly, they began to move through the cabin with a new kind of sincerity. The tall attendant knelt to help an elderly woman adjust her seatbelt, his voice gentle. The sharp-laughed attendant offered extra blankets to passengers, her smile small but genuine. The younger attendants listened more closely, responding with patience and care. Passengers noticed the change. A woman in row 10 whispered to her husband, "They're different now. It's like they're trying to make up for something." Her husband nodded. "Maybe they are." The cabin, once filled with whispers of curiosity, began to soften. The passengers relaxed, sensing the shift. The crew, humbled and chastened, carried themselves with a quiet dignity they had never shown before. And though Amara remained in the cockpit, her presence was everywhere. In the way the crew moved, in the way the passengers felt, in the way respect had been redefined at 35,000 feet. If you had been given the chance to change after being exposed, would you take it and grow, or would you cling to the person you used to be? The first light of dawn spilled across the horizon as the plane began its descent. The cabin, once filled with whispers and speculation, had grown quiet. Passengers sat in reflective silence, some staring out the windows at the soft glow of morning, others replaying the extraordinary revelation they had witnessed hours earlier. The woman they had seen in a cleaner's uniform was not only part of the crew, she was the owner of the airline itself. The crew moved through the aisles with a humility that was almost unrecognizable. The tall attendant, who had once led the laughter, now bent low to help an elderly man with his seatbelt, his voice gentle, his movements careful. The sharp-laughed attendant, her arrogance long gone, offered water to a child with a smile that was small but sincere. The younger attendants carried themselves with quiet dignity, their every gesture a silent promise to do better. Passengers noticed. A businessman in first class leaned toward his neighbor. "They're different now," he murmured. "It's like they've been humbled." His neighbor nodded. Maybe that's what she wanted all along. The cockpit door opened, and Amara stepped out once more. The cabin fell silent instantly, every eye turning toward her. She stood tall, her presence commanding yet calm, her gaze sweeping over the passengers and crew alike. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "we are preparing to land. But before we do, I want to leave you with something more than just a safe arrival." The silence deepened, every ear straining to hear. "Tonight, you witnessed something unusual. You saw how quickly judgment can turn to shame, how arrogance can crumble when faced with truth. But you also saw something else, the possibility of change. Respect is not about uniforms or titles or appearances. It is about recognizing the dignity in every person you meet. That is the promise this airline was built on, and it is the promise I intend to keep." Her eyes shifted to the crew, who stood frozen, their faces pale but attentive. Mistakes were made tonight, but mistakes are not the end. They are the beginning, if we choose to learn from them. And I believe we can. The crew lowered their heads, their shame tempered now by a fragile hope. The passengers, moved by her words, sat in silence, some nodding, some smiling faintly. Amara gave a small nod, then returned to the cockpit. The door closed softly behind her, but the echo of her words lingered in the cabin, heavier than the roar of the engines. Moments later, the plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway as the sun rose higher in the sky. Passengers applauded, some out of habit, others out of genuine admiration for the woman who had turned an ordinary flight into a lesson they would never forget. As the plane taxied to the gate, the crew moved through the cabin one last time. Their smiles were no longer masks, but quiet acknowledgments of the journey they had taken, not just through the skies, but through humility, shame, and the first steps of redemption. And when the passengers disembarked, many glanced back at the cockpit door, their eyes filled with respect for the woman who had reminded them all of a truth too often forgotten, that dignity is not worn on a uniform, but carried in the heart. If you had been on that flight, would you have walked away unchanged, or would you have carried her lesson with you into every encounter that followed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.